Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The botched executions of Tudor England. During the reigns of the Tudor Kings and Queens, we associate the time period with extreme bloodshed and barbarism. In Henry VIII's reign, there were estimated over 70,000 people sentenced to death and killed for crimes in his almost 4 decades on the throne. We associate Henry and his children with religious turmoil and also sending anyone, even their closest friends and advisors, to their deaths. Henry executed 2 of his wives and was also known for turning on his closest friends. Mary I, also Henry's eldest daughter, is known as Bloody Mary for her treatment of Protestants, where she ordered many to be burned at the stake. It was a time of great bloodshed, but there was an expectation upon those whose job it was to perform executions to carry out their work professionally. Being an executioner was a public offence, and if things did not go well, then an executioner could be liable to much criticism and hatred. It was their job to carry out the king or queen's will, executing the condemned. But if they didn't do a proper job, then things could turn very sour. During one botched execution, where Jack Ketch was made a mess of proceedings beheading someone, it was said that almost a riot was incited, with the crowd crying for the blood of the executioner next. Today we look at some of the most botched executions of the Tudor period. One of Henry VIII's closest advisors and friends was Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was the architect behind the downfall of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and he was a master schemer at court. He was the man behind the dissolution of the monasteries, where religious orders and houses were shut down, resulting in the king becoming incredibly rich. He had immense power and favour in Henry's eyes. However, Cromwell's own fall from grace came when he made a mess of the king's 4th marriage to Anne of Cleves. His enemies in court sought to stick their talons into Cromwell and convinced the king to arrest him. He was taken to the Tower of London, and an act of attainder sentenced him to death without even the need for a trial. He was greatly disgraced, losing all of his titles and lands. And on the 28th of July 1540, he was brought to Tower Hill to be executed by the axe. It was a huge public spectacle, with the scaffold surrounded by thousands to see possibly the second most powerful man in the country facing his own death. As he was on the scaffold, he made a short speech preparing to die in the Catholic faith. However, what happened next was up to debate. There are numerous accounts that state different things. However, one contemporary chronicler wrote of Cromwell's execution that he so patiently suffered the stroke of the axe by ragged and botching miser, which very ungodly performed the office. It was claimed that it took several blows to decapitate Cromwell, which would have been very painful for him, with the first swing not being deadly. It would have only prolonged the suffering. It was believed that an inexperienced and unskilled axeman hacked away at his neck, with a number of clowns, neither in a swift nor merciful manner. One woman to feel the wrath of King Henry VIII was Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. She was the daughter of George, the Duke of Clarence, who was the brother of Edward IV and Richard III. She posed a significant threat to Henry, as she was one of the final surviving Plantagenets at the end of the War of the Roses, and she initially was in favour at court. However, her son Reginald was vocal about the king's split from the Catholic Church, and he was well thought of by the palace. The Poles were a threat to Henry Tudor's blood, as the Plantagenet dynasty could have been interpreted as the rightful claimants to the throne. Margaret Pole was arrested at the age of 65, being an elderly woman by Tudor standards. She was taken to the Tower of London and had her titles and lands stripped from her. However, evidence was provided that allegedly showed Margaret's overt support for the Catholic Church. She was imprisoned for 2 years inside the Tower of London, and her imprisonment was very harsh for a woman of her age. What happened on the day of her execution, the 27th of May 1541, has gone down in history with much shock and also scepticism. It's considered fact, however, that her execution did not go very straightforward. In front of a crowd of around 150, the executioner was described as a wretched and blundering youth. It was said by the imperial advisor to the Roman Emperor Eustace Chapuis that Pole's head and shoulders were hacked to pieces in a most pitiful manner. It was said that the inexperienced axeman missed her neck on the first blow, and then it took 10 further blows of the axe to finally separate her head from her body, which made a huge mess. The Victorians believed also that following one of the swings, Margaret Pole jumped up from the block and began to run around the tower's courtyard, before she was then wrestled to the floor by the executioner, who then took many swings to take her head off. We then look at the Guernsey martyrs. These were 3 women who were burnt at the stake for their Protestantism during the reign of Mary I. She had restored the lands to Catholicism following her ascent onto the throne, and the time began to become categorised by the Marian persecutions, high-profile executions of prominent Protestants. Guillemine Gilbert and Perettine Massey, 2 sisters, along with their mother, Catherine Cautious, who were to be burnt alive for heresy. Their execution was carried out around the 18th of July 1556, and they were all together burnt on the same fire. Now all 3 of them were due to have been strangled to death beforehand. However, the rope that was doing the strangling snapped, and they were all burnt on the fire, alive. However, what makes this execution even more sadistic is that according to John Fox, Perettine Massey was heavily pregnant at the time, and it was said, the belly of the woman burst asunder by the vehemence of the flames. The infant fell into the fire. This was incredibly barbaric. It is accepted that Massey was pregnant, and the law would have stated that she would have been excused from the execution until the baby was born and then later executed. This was in particularly seen as a barbaric execution that should not have been carried out as it did. Now Nicholas Ridley, along with Hugh Latimer, were burnt alive at the stake on the 16th of October 1555 in Oxford. Both of the men had been senior figures in the church before Mary I's time on the throne, and both had been involved in Protestant reforms during the reign of Henry VIII and Edward VI. Nicholas Ridley was the Bishop of London and Westminster, and he was known for supporting Lady Jane Grey, Mary I's key rival to the throne. Jane's leading supporters had been arrested and rounded up, and it was ordered that Ridley, Latimer and Thomas Cranmer were to be sent to the Bocardo prison in Oxford to be tried for heresy. Ridley himself signed the letters giving the throne to Lady Jane Grey, so by doing this he virtually signed his death sentence. Accused of heresy, they were to be burnt at the stake. Ridley and Latimer were burnt together. But what made this execution in particularly barbaric was that the scene the crowd saw that day was incredibly savage. Nicholas Ridley was tied to a stake and then was lit on fire. It was not quick for Ridley to be killed. He burnt incredibly slowly and suffered in horrific pain. His brother-in-law allegedly put more tinder on the pyre to quicken his death, but this only burnt his lower parts. Eventually he did succumb to the fire, but seeing the bishop struggling and hearing him screaming as the flames got higher must have been a horrific sight to have heard. One of the most high-profile executions in English history was that of Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a constant threat to Elizabeth I's throne, as Catholics turned to her to try to oust the Protestant Elizabeth from the throne. Because of this, a number of plots emerged to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary. When Mary turned to England following fearing her life in Scotland, Elizabeth allowed her to stay in England, but she was imprisoned for a long period of time. The Babington plot was what signed Mary's death sentence, as she consented to a plan to break her out of prison and assassinate Elizabeth. The English Queen was hesitant to organise her execution, but eventually was convinced to do so. At Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February 1587, she was taken into the Great Hall and was faced by a scaffold draped in black cloth. She climbed the 3 steps to the scaffold and saw the block with a cushion for her to kneel on. There was also 3 stalls for her, the Earls of Shrewsbury and the Earl of Kent, who were there to witness the execution on behalf of the Queen. The executioner, a man named Bull, asked for her forgiveness, and Mary gave this. She was then blindfolded by one of her ladies-in-waiting, and she knelt her head in position. She was lying with her head on the block, and then suddenly the former Scottish monarch stretched out her arms, indicating for the executioner to swing his axe. However, he did not behead Mary in one swift strike. The first blow missed her neck, and in fact struck her in the back of the head, possibly fracturing her skull. The second blow almost severed her neck. However, a small piece of sinew held her head to the neck. The executioner then had to saw through this with his axe blade. He then held up Mary's head, declaring, "God save the Queen," but as he grabbed her hair, it was discovered she was wearing a wig. The head of the Queen fell onto the floor and rolled, with the executioner standing there holding the Queen's wig. It was not a fitting end for a once great monarch. So during the Tudor period, there were many botched executions. These were only just a few of the more high-profile ones that did not go very well. However, there were definitely more that haven't gone down in documented history. It was not an easy job for an executioner to take the life of another. For example, using an axe was known to have been rather unreliable, and only the most skilled were capable of taking a head in one swing. Even hangings went wrong in many cases, and drawings and quarterings show the barbaric nature of the time period. Overall, the Tudor period was one you did not want to live inside of. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.